The day started like any other in my ninth grade classroom. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden rays, illuminating the organized chaos of pencils, notebooks, and scattered papers. I had taught this class for years, and I thought I knew every inch of it. The dynamics, the personalities, the subtle undercurrents that only reveal themselves when a teacher watches long enough. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight that would nearly stop my heart that afternoon. My daughter was seated quietly in the third row, always diligent, always polite, the kind of student who made a teacher quietly proud without seeking attention. I was fortunate, of course, to have her in my class. It was a small comfort amidst the daily chaos of adolescence. But in the same room, there was another student, someone who seemed incapable of leaving anyone alone. He had a reputation that preceded him, flirtatious, obnoxious, and relentless in his attempts to charm or irritate the girls in the class. I had sent him to the office more times than I could count, had watched him receive countless reprimands, and even witnessed him endure the physical consequences of girls slapping him repeatedly for crossing boundaries. Somehow, despite all the warnings, he always returned, always searching for new ways to push limits, to get attention, to test the boundaries of authority and decency. That day, I had allowed him to sit in the back. For some reason, he begged, practically pleading, and without clear reasoning, I gave in. Perhaps I wanted to see if a little freedom would tame his chaos, or perhaps I underestimated the gravity of his audacity. The classroom hummed with the low, concentrated noise of pencils scratching on paper and the occasional cough, the air thick with teenage energy. I had just explained the latest portion of the assignment, walking between rows to check students' work, when a subtle whispering caught my attention. Ipauset, mie, are straining. Whispering in the middle of silent focus is always noticeable, a kind of piercing background noise that sets a teacher on high alert. I turned my head toward the back, expecting to see the usual mischievous glances or notes pass between students. But what I saw froze me in place, blood pounding in my ears like a drum. At first, my brain refused to comprehend. There, in the hands of the boy who had been a perpetual thorn in my side, was a handgun. My initial thought was disbelief, followed by a surreal sense that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had to blink, had to focus, had to convince myself that what I was seeing was impossible. I had taught self-control, caution, and vigilance for years, but in that moment, every lesson I had ever imparted collided with a primal fear gripping my chest. Sweat pooled on my forehead, trickled down the back of my neck. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, but I knew I had to stay calm, had to maintain some semblance of composure so I could protect the students nearest him, including my daughter. I knew instinctively that moving too quickly, panicking, or drawing attention could trigger disaster. My voice, when I finally found it, would need to be measured, controlled, seemingly indifferent even while my pulse was threatening to explode in my ears. I slowly moved toward a student at my desk to simulate assistance, using the motion as an excuse to better assess the situation without appearing suspicious. And when I caught a clearer view, I realized it was real. The cold, unyielding metal of a gun. Not a toy. Not a replica. Real. My breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the weight of the classroom pressing down on me, the walls closing in, the chaos of my responsibility as a teacher amplified to unbearable proportions. This wasn't just about discipline anymore. This wasn't about a misbehaving student or a detention. This was life or death, and the clock was already ticking. I dialed 911, but my fingers trembled so violently that it took multiple attempts to press the correct buttons. My voice, when it reached the dispatcher, was too quiet to carry urgency, too quiet to convey the invisible tension in the room. I couldn't leave, I couldn't draw attention, I couldn't let the other students realize the danger. They were oblivious, busy with pencils, books, papers, unaware that a potential disaster hovered behind them, mere feet away. My thoughts raced frantically. Get my daughter out, protect the nearest students, keep everyone calm. I didn't even think about my own safety. I knew instinctively that my primary objective was survival, not for myself, but for those in my care. I texted our assistant principal in all caps, describing exactly what I had seen, hoping for an immediate response. The minutes dragged on like hours, the weight of every second crushing me. When there was no answer, I realized I could no longer wait. I had to act. I needed a plan, and I needed it to be flawless, quiet, and utterly effective. I called over one of the students I trusted, a girl bright and attentive, someone my instincts told me could handle responsibility under pressure. I scribbled a note with precise instructions. Go to the assistant principal, have him check his phone immediately, and leave the school as quietly as possible. The message had to be clear and simple. There was no room for misunderstanding. When she saw the note, her eyes widened, the gravity of the situation apparent, yet she didn't hesitate. Without a word, she left, moving with the silent urgency of someone who understood that seconds could mean life or death. I watched her go, the floor suddenly feeling colder, the room suddenly heavier. I returned to my desk, trying to act as if everything were normal, as if the whispering and the metal in the back row were part of some ordinary, mundane classroom drama. But the tension was palpable. The other students began to sense it, catching the edge of fear in my posture, the tightness in my jaw, the way my hands trembled ever so slightly on the desk. I had to maintain calmness outwardly, even as the storm raged inside me. And then he knocked on the door. The boy in question, the one holding the gun, strolled in casually, as if nothing were wrong, as if he were oblivious to the chaos he had nearly unleashed. He chatted briefly with a few students, laughing, joking, the very image of teenage arrogance and bravado, while the weight of what I knew pressed down on me like a physical force. I could feel my daughter's eyes on me, wide and fearful, and I silently urged her to stay calm, to not make a sound, to follow my lead. My heart raced uncontrollably, and the seconds stretched into an eternity. I could only hope that my calm demeanor would keep the students unaware, and that the assistant principal would arrive in time. The whispering, the laughter, the casual chatter, it all became background noise to the sharp, terrifying focus that held me captive. Finally, the assistant principal entered the room and, with precise authority, asked the boy to step into the hall. Each step the boy took past my daughter's desk was unbearable, my mind imagining every possible outcome, each more horrifying than the last. As soon as he left the room, the tension exploded into action. Security and staff tackled him to the ground in the hallway, disarming him before any harm could come to anyone. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, sudden and overwhelming. Yet even in that moment, my body shook uncontrollably, my pulse pounding, adrenaline coursing through me in chaotic surges. I had protected my students, my daughter was safe, and the immediate threat was neutralized, but the aftershocks of what I had seen would linger for a long time. I realized that teaching in that instant wasn't just about imparting knowledge. It was about vigilance, about responsibility, about the unbearable weight of knowing that the lives entrusted to me could hinge on a single, terrifying decision. I had stared into the abyss that day, and somehow by grace or instinct or sheer luck, walked away with my students intact, my daughter unharmed, and the memory of a near catastrophe seared permanently into my mind. Even after the boy was disarmed, escorted away, and the commotion in the hallway settled, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I could still feel the cold weight of the gun in the back of my mind, as if the metal itself had embedded itself in my memory. The students around me were wide-eyed, whispers growing like a low hum, each realization dawning too slowly for my comfort. Some had glanced toward my daughter, who was sitting perfectly still, lips pressed together, eyes shimmering with fear that she refused to let anyone see. I wanted to go to her, wrap her in my arms, and tell her it was over, but I couldn't leave the rest of the students unprotected. Every instinct I had screamed at me that the danger might not be gone, that one mistake, one misstep, could reignite the nightmare. I forced myself to breathe, counting in my head, trying to normalize the room, to make it appear as though nothing had happened, though I knew it would never feel the same again. The assistant principal took control with military precision, asking students to remain seated while he spoke to security on his walkie-talkie. His voice was calm, authoritative, a stark contrast to the chaos still thrumming under my skin. I watched the boy being led down the hall, flanked by two officers, hands cuffed, still smirking, still somehow attempting to project the same bravado that had gotten him into trouble countless times before. But this time, it wasn't enough. The mask had fallen, revealing something raw and dangerous beneath. I thought of the countless times I had warned him, disciplined him, explained the consequences of his actions, never imagining I would see the full weight of what those actions could mean. And then, just as I exhaled in relief, the first wave of reality hit me. I had to report this, write statements, reassure terrified parents, and explain why a child in ninth grade even had access to a firearm in the first place. My stomach churned at the thought, the bureaucratic nightmare why. Seemed to consume every second of my life for the next few weeks. But even beyond paperwork, beyond authority, there was a raw, human panic clawing at me. I had stared death in the face, not for myself, but for my students, for my daughter, for the fragile bubble of safety I had tried to create in that classroom, and I had lived through it. My daughter, sensing my gaze, finally looked up at me. Her expression was a mixture of fear and admiration, something that tightened my chest. I gave her a small, reassuring nod, not wanting to draw attention but needing her to know that everything would be okay. She swallowed hard, nodding slightly, her hands gripping her notebook so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath her fingers. I wanted to tell her that the fear she felt wasn't weakness, that bravery wasn't the absence of fear but the act of moving forward despite it. But my throat felt thick, words lodged halfway up, and I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the students around me, making small gestures to calm them, asking quiet questions about their assignments, redirecting their attention while the echoes of the hallway struggle still reverberated in my mind. Each moment stretched painfully, filled with the invisible weight of what could have been, the constant pulse of adrenaline making time seem slower, sharper, almost cruel in its intensity. Minutes later, the room began to settle. The officers left, taking the boy with them, and the assistant principal returned to provide explanations, instructions, and reassurances. Still, the energy in the room was different. There was an unspoken understanding among the students, a quiet tension that made them glance at each other nervously, whispering in small clusters, sharing the enormity of what they had just witnessed without truly having words to describe it. I walked through the rows, checking in with my students, making casual comments about their work, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy while my mind raced, replaying every second, every decision I had made, every risk I had taken. Each thought was punctuated by the terrifying memory of that medal in his hands, the way it reflected the fluorescent lights above, the sound of its weight shifting as he showed it to another student. I could still see it clearly, as if it were etched in my memory in high definition, a vivid reminder that life can change in an instant. Once the students were finally engaged with their work again, my daughter leaned over slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, was he going to?" I froze for a moment, feeling the full impact of her question. She didn't need to finish it. I didn't need to hear it. The truth of the scenario was undeniable, and my chest tightened with a mix of relief, guilt, and lingering terror. I reached out subtly, squeezing her hand, giving her the comfort I couldn't put into words. "He won't hurt anyone again," I said quietly, more to myself than to her, and she nodded, her small, serious expression showing a depth of understanding far beyond her age. The resilience of children astounded me, their ability to absorb trauma in ways that left adults gasping. I wanted to tell her that the world wasn't always this dangerous, that teachers and parents had protective barriers that kept them safe, but I knew she had already seen that those barriers could sometimes fail. The rest of the day moved like a blur. Administrators, counselors, and officers circulated through the school, taking statements, securing evidence, and ensuring that no immediate threats remained. My role shifted from teacher to crisis manager, my voice and demeanor carefully calibrated to balance authority and calm reassurance. I answered questions, comforted anxious students, and tried to explain, as delicately as possible, why such an incident could happen, all while feeling the invisible weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders like a physical force. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, I felt both relief and exhaustion in equal measure. Relief that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion from the constant tension, and an underlying anxiety that this experience would echo in my mind for weeks, perhaps years. I gathered my daughter's things and walked her to the car, each step measured, careful, almost ritualistic, as though the act of walking out safely could somehow restore the equilibrium that had been violently disrupted in the classroom. That evening, at home, I tried to decompress. My hands still shook intermittently, and my heart refused to settle. I made my daughter dinner, talking softly about mundane things, trying to inject normalcy into a day that had been anything but normal. But behind my careful facade, memories of the gun, the boy, the potential disaster, replayed relentlessly. I realized that even if I never saw the gun again, even if the student was expelled, arrested, or otherwise removed from the school, the psychological imprint would remain. Every glance, every whisper, every student interaction could be colored by the shadow of that day. And yet, despite the terror, I felt a quiet sense of pride. I had acted decisively, protecting those in my care, making split-second decisions under unimaginable pressure, and somehow navigating a nightmare with both calm and clarity. It was a harsh reminder that Ching was never just about textbooks or tests. It was about vigilance, courage, and the sometimes impossible responsibility of caring for young lives. The night stretched on. I sat at my kitchen table, the silence punctuated only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator, replaying each moment like a slow-motion reel in my mind. The gun, the whispering, the terrified expressions of my students, my daughter's small hand in mine, the panic, the adrenaline, the relief. And through it all, the realization settled in, heavy and unyielding. Life could change in an instant, and sometimes survival depended on instincts you didn't even know you had. I made a silent vow to myself, a promise that no matter what, I would never allow my students or my daughter to face danger alone. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new decisions that could alter everything in ways I could not yet imagine. But for tonight, at least, we had survived. The next morning, the air in the school felt heavier than usual. Even before stepping through the doors, I sensed a subtle shift, the kind of tension that creeps into the corners of a building after a serious incident. Security guards at the entrance were more alert, moving with a deliberate purpose that reflected the gravity of the previous day. Students whispered as they entered, some casting furtive glances toward the back of the classrooms, others avoiding eye contact entirely. There was a nervous energy that buzzed under the surface, like a static charge, waiting to be released. I walked in with my daughter, trying to maintain my usual calm demeanor, forcing myself to smile at familiar faces even though my mind was spinning with what-ifs. The adrenaline from yesterday had not left me. It had morphed into a taut string of anxiety, a constant reminder that the danger had not only existed, it could exist again. As I prepared the classroom, organizing papers and setting out the assignment for the day, I could feel the eyes of my students on me. Some seemed genuinely curious, perhaps even frightened, while others tried to mask their anxiety behind feigned disinterest. The boy who had brought the gun was no longer in class. He had been suspended immediately, and the school administration was already beginning its internal investigation. But his absence did little to alleviate the tension. In fact, it intensified it. The students, especially those who had witnessed the weapon firsthand, were now processing what had happened, and I could see the mix of fear, relief, and lingering shock etched on their faces. I understood completely. I had seen it myself, the sharp, cold terror that accompanies a close brush with danger. I had felt it in the pit of my stomach, in the sweat on my palms, in the quivering of my voice that day. And now, I was watching my students navigate the same storm of emotions. Throughout the morning, I noticed subtle signs that some of the students were struggling to maintain composure. One girl, usually energetic and talkative, sat hunched over her desk, hands clenched around her pencil, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Another boy kept glancing toward the empty seat at the back, the one where the gun-wielding student had sat, and I could almost see his mind replaying yesterday's events like a looping film. My daughter, thankfully, seemed more resilient, though I could tell she was acutely aware of the tension surrounding her. She moved quietly, focused on her work, her eyes occasionally flicking toward me as if seeking reassurance. I gave her small nods, subtle gestures to let her know that everything would be okay, that we had survived, and that I was still there for her. But inside, I was aware that this was only the beginning. The real aftermath, the investigation, the discussions with parents, the lingering psychological impact was only just starting. By mid-morning, the assistant principal had requested a meeting with all teachers who had been present during the incident. We gathered in a small, windowless conference room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the polished wooden table. The tension in the room was palpable. Every teacher was acutely aware of the gravity of what had occurred. We exchanged quiet, almost desperate glances, each silently asking the others if they had felt the same terror, the same adrenaline, the same helplessness. The assistant principal began by outlining the steps the school would take to handle the situation: counseling for students, communication with parents, and a detailed report to be submitted to the district office. As he spoke, I realized that my mind was only half listening. The other half was replaying the image of the gun, the boy's smug expression, the seconds that had felt like an eternity as I calculated how to protect everyone in the classroom. I shivered slightly, though the room was warm, and pressed my hands against the table to steady myself. The thought that one small misstep could have led to a catastrophe still haunted me. After the meeting, I returned to my classroom, where the students had been left in a kind of anxious limbo. I could see the fear still lingering, subtle but undeniable. I moved through the room slowly, checking in on each student individually, offering quiet reassurance. Some responded with gratitude, others with silent nods, and a few, overwhelmed by the experience, struggled to focus at all. I realized that the emotional aftermath of yesterday's incident might be far more challenging to navigate than the event itself. Fear, once implanted, has a way of echoing long after the danger has passed, replaying in subtle triggers, small reminders, and the occasional shadow in a familiar corner. I made a mental note to arrange additional support for my students, including extra counseling sessions and open discussions where they could express their fears without judgment. Protecting them physically had been one battle. Now I had to protect them emotionally too. By lunchtime, the tension had become almost tangible. Students whispered in hushed tones, sharing fragments of information and speculation about the boy who had brought the gun, about how he had planned to use it, and what could have happened if he had succeeded. Rumors began to spread, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, and I had to navigate the delicate task of correcting misinformation while maintaining calm. I noticed my daughter sitting with her friends, engaged in conversation but still keeping one eye on me, as if gauging whether I was genuinely okay. I smiled reassuringly at her, knowing that she needed me to appear composed, even if inside I was still grappling with the fear that had gripped me the day before. I reminded myself that I had to be the anchor for my students, the steady presence in the midst of chaos, and I took a deep breath, centering myself before entering the lunchroom to oversee the students. The lunch period itself was a study in controlled chaos. While the boy responsible for the incident was absent, the memory of him lingered, affecting student behavior. Teachers and staff moved through the room with heightened vigilance, observing interactions closely, ensuring that no one acted out in fear, confusion, or retaliation. I stationed myself near my daughter's table, subtly monitoring the students while making casual conversation to maintain a sense of normalcy. The reality was that no amount of supervision could completely erase the psychological impact of the previous day. Children process trauma differently, and I could see the subtle signs of anxiety in nearly every corner of the room: fidgeting, nervous laughter, whispered conversations, and occasional panicked glances toward the empty seat at the back. I understood all too well how those emotions could simmer beneath the surface, potentially erupting in unexpected ways. After lunch, the district's crisis response team arrived to conduct interviews and gather statements. Officers spoke with students, administrators, and teachers, each interaction meticulously documented. I watched closely, observing the students' reactions, noting who seemed genuinely frightened, who seemed confused, and who was capable of discussing the incident with relative composure. My daughter was interviewed separately, and I could see the concern on the officer's face as he tried to put her at ease. I stayed near us, silently offering reassurance without intruding, knowing that my presence alone could help her feel secure. The interviews were long, exhausting, and emotionally taxing for everyone involved, but they were necessary to ensure that the incident was properly understood and addressed. Even as I participated in the process, my mind kept replaying the most terrifying moments: the glint of the metal, the boy's smirk, the seconds that stretched into lifetimes. The experience had left an indelible mark, one that I knew would linger long after the paperwork was complete. By the end of the day, exhaustion had taken over. My body was drained from adrenaline, my mind overtaxed from constant vigilance, and my heart still carried the weight of fear. Walking home with my daughter, I reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. The reality of what could have happened, the responsibility I bore, and the courage I had managed to summon in the face of immediate danger all collided in a whirlwind of emotion. I realized that teaching, while rewarding, carried a responsibility far greater than I had ever anticipated. Protecting students from academic failure was one thing. Protecting them from real, tangible danger was another entirely. And yet, despite the trauma, despite the lingering anxiety, I felt a sense of quiet pride. I had acted decisively, had kept my students safe, and had survived an experience that could have been catastrophic. That night, as my daughter slept peacefully in her room, I sat alone, grappling with the enormity of what had occurred, the lingering fear, and the realization that life could change in an instant, and that as a teacher, a parent, and a human being, I had to be ready for anything. The next morning, the school felt like a different place entirely. Hallways that were usually filled with the casual chatter and laughter of students now echoed with cautious steps and hushed voices. Even the lockers seemed heavier somehow, as if the metal casings themselves carried the memory of the previous day's terror. I arrived early, earlier than usual, my stomach twisting with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Every teacher I passed gave a small nod or a tight smile, a silent acknowledgement that the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Nothing would feel normal again, not today, not ever. And yet, I had to carry myself as if it were just another school day, because my students relied on me to anchor their fear, to provide stability amidst uncertainty. The principal had called an emergency staff meeting before the students arrived, and as I entered the room, the weight of administrative concern pressed down on everyone present. Counselors, security officers, and district representatives were already gathered, their faces serious, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of hesitation or weakness. The principal's voice was calm but firm as he outlined the steps being taken to ensure student safety. Increased security checks at entrances, stricter monitoring of backpacks, mandatory reporting for anything unusual, and a series of counseling sessions for the students directly affected. We were also instructed to prepare ourselves for possible media attention, though I could barely comprehend the magnitude of that. The thought of reporters, cameras, and headlines focusing on our students made my stomach churn. I'd already lived through the fear, the adrenaline, the terror of nearly losing my students, and now I had to imagine the world watching, scrutinizing every reaction, every word, every minor misstep. It felt almost unbearable. Once the students arrived, it was clear that yesterday's incident had already left its mark. Eyes flicked nervously toward the back of the classroom where the gun-wielding student had sat. Conversations were quieter, more deliberate, and laughter was measured, almost cautious. I moved through the room slowly, greeting students individually, offering small words of reassurance, and subtly gauging their emotional state. My daughter was unusually quiet, her usual energy subdued, though she maintained her composure better than most of her peers. I caught her eye from across the room and gave a small, comforting nod. She returned it with a faint smile, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly on her desk. I knew that even after the immediate danger had passed, the psychological aftermath would linger for weeks, if not months. Trauma leaves traces that aren't easily erased. During the morning period, the counselors came into the classroom individually to speak with the students who had been closest to the incident. I observed from my desk, careful not to intervene unless necessary. Their voices were calm and measured, encouraging students to express their fear, confusion, and frustration. Some students responded openly, while others were silent, eyes downcast, as though voicing their emotions would somehow make them real or permanent. I realized that each child processed fear differently, and my role was to facilitate a safe space while also maintaining order and focus. My own heart still raced unpredictably whenever I glanced toward the empty seat at the back. The memory of the gun, the smirk on the boy's face, and the seconds that had felt like an eternity returned in sharp, unrelenting flashes. By mid-morning, news had begun to circulate more widely within the school. Parents had been notified, and rumors were spreading rapidly through whispers, digital messages, and social media. The boy's intentions, motives, and the potential scope of the threat were being discussed in hushed, speculative tones. I could feel my own pulse quicken each time I overheard a snippet, each time a student's voice betrayed the lingering fear beneath their attempts at normalcy. I reminded myself repeatedly that what mattered most was keeping the students present focused, safe, and calm. I moved through the room with deliberate attention, correcting misconceptions gently, answering questions with care, and providing reassurance without minimizing the severity of the incident. It was a delicate balance. Too much information could exacerbate anxiety, but too little would leave the students feeling confused and vulnerable. When lunchtime arrived, the cafeteria was tense, almost surreal in its quiet vigilance. Teachers and staff patrolled with heightened awareness, watching for unusual behavior, monitoring interactions closely, and subtly reminding students to stay calm. I positioned myself near my daughter's table, engaging her in conversation while scanning the room for any signs of distress. Several students approached me quietly, seeking reassurance, asking questions that reflected both curiosity and fear. I answered each one carefully, striving to instill a sense of security even as the adrenaline lingered in my veins. The boy responsible for the incident was absent, yet the fear he had instilled was palpable, lingering like smoke from a fire that had already burned but whose embers still glowed. After lunch, the school district's crisis management team arrived to conduct formal interviews and gather detailed statements. I accompanied my daughter for her interview, ensuring that she understood she was safe, that her voice mattered, and that her feelings were valid. The officers were professional, empathetic, and meticulous in their questioning, creating an environment that encouraged honesty and openness. Still, I could see the residual fear in my daughter's eyes, the careful way she measured her words, the hesitance to revisit the terror of yesterday. I held her hand subtly, a silent promise that she would be protected, that I would navigate this alongside her, and that despite the lingering fear, we would endure. By mid-afternoon, the immediate administrative tasks began to wind down, but the psychological strain remained. I returned to the classroom, where students were tasked with completing assignments under the watchful eye of teachers and support staff. The usual energy of a ninth-grade classroom was muted, replaced by an almost palpable tension that hovered over every interaction. I moved among the students, offering guidance, correcting work, and engaging in quiet conversations to assess their emotional state. Each small gesture, each word of reassurance, was aimed at reinforcing stability and a sense of safety. I recognized that the real work of healing was only beginning. Trauma, once inflicted, leaves invisible scars, and I knew that many of my students would carry these memories long after the immediate danger had passed. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, I gathered my daughter and her belongings. The walk home was quiet, punctuated by small, deliberate conversation aimed at normalizing our routine. I reflected on the past 24 hours, the fear, the decisions, the responsibility, and the narrow escape from disaster. I realized that my role as a teacher extended far beyond academics. It encompassed vigilance, courage, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. It also encompassed the emotional well-being of my students, the subtle art of providing reassurance, and the understanding that fear leaves lasting marks. That night, as I prepared for the next day, I knew the days ahead would require both patience and fortitude. The events of the past 2 days had transformed my perspective on teaching, safety, and the fragile nature of trust and responsibility. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the lingering tension, I felt a quiet determination to protect, to guide, and to endure no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The following morning, the weight of the previous day's events lingered like a fog over the school. As I walked through the front doors, I noticed subtle changes everywhere. Security guards more vigilant, administrators speaking in hushed but urgent tones, and students moving with a cautious deliberation that had replaced the usual clamor of high school energy. Even the air felt charged, heavy with unspoken anxiety. I could feel my own heartbeat thrumming beneath my skin, the adrenaline from the near catastrophe still echoing in my veins. Every glance from a student, every whispered conversation, and every small gesture seemed amplified in significance. Nothing would feel normal for a long time, if ever again. The principal had organized another emergency staff meeting, this time including district officials and a school psychologist who had been called in to assess the student's emotional state. The room was filled with tensity, on the kind of silent pressure that makes you hyper-aware of every movement and every word. Each of us recounted our experiences from the previous day, describing what we saw, how we reacted, and the immediate impact on the students. Listening to the other teachers, I realized that while we had all survived the incident physically, the emotional weight was a burden we would carry long after the event itself. I spoke last, detailing my perspective, explaining how I had tried to maintain calm, protect my students, and ensure my daughter's safety while simultaneously alerting authorities. The words felt inadequate in capturing the raw, visceral fear I had experienced. Once the meeting concluded, we returned to our classrooms. The students arrived with subdued energy, whispers circulating about the boy who had been removed, the police presence in the hallway, and the investigation that was now intensifying. The rumor mill was in full swing, and part of my role that day was to ensure accuracy while simultaneously reassuring students that they were safe. I moved among them, answering questions carefully, making sure to acknowledge their fear without amplifying it. Some students expressed relief at the boy's absence, while others were quietly curious about his motives. The challenge was immense. Every word, every expression could shape their perception, either mitigating fear or exacerbating it. Parents began arriving unexpectedly, seeking updates on the situation. Anxiety radiated off them in waves, and their concern was palpable. Questions came in rapid succession. Was my child in danger? How did this happen? Will it happen again? I did my best to provide clear and calm explanations, though inside I still felt the raw tension from the incident. Every parent I spoke to seemed to be balancing gratitude and fear, relief and incredulity. Many admitted to sleepless nights worrying about their children, and I silently shared their anxiety, fully understanding how fragile the sense of safety could feel. Some parents wanted immediate answers about disciplinary action. Others simply needed reassurance that their child would be okay. I spoke carefully, deliberately, each word chosen to convey authority, empathy, and reassurance. Throughout the day, Counselors moved from classroom to classroom, meeting with students who had been most affected by the incident. I watched from a distance as some students broke down, releasing fears they had carried silently since the confrontation. Others processed the event intellectually, asking thoughtful questions, trying to understand motives, risks, and outcomes. It became clear that trauma manifests in countless ways, and part of my role was simply to be present, observing, supporting, and providing stability. My daughter remained calm, but I could see subtle signs of lingering anxiety, a nervous tapping of her foot, a furrowed brow as she concentrated on her work, the occasional hesitant glance toward me for reassurance. I knew that while the immediate threat was neutralized, the psychological impact would remain, demanding attention, patience, and understanding. Later that afternoon, the school administration convened another meeting, this time with parents and law enforcement officials. The district's chief of security outlined the steps being taken to prevent any future incidents, including increased monitoring, stricter entry protocols, and mandatory reporting procedures. Police officers explained the investigation process, assuring parents that the student responsible would face legal consequences. Questions were intense, emotions high, and the atmosphere thick with tension. Parents voiced anger, fear, and frustration, while others expressed gratitude for the quick response that had prevented tragedy. I sat silently, absorbing the raw emotion, understanding fully that my role extended beyond the classroom. I had been responsible for protecting these students, and the weight of that responsibility now spilled into every corner of the school community. Returning to my classroom after the meeting, I found students still processing the day's events. Conversations were hesitant, measured, and sometimes strained. It became evident that the incident had changed the dynamics of the classroom. The invisible tension lingered, coloring every interaction. I moved carefully among the students, providing reassurance, answering questions, and creating opportunities for dialogue. I emphasized that their feelings were valid, that their fear was natural, and that together we would navigate the aftermath. I encouraged them to speak openly about what had happened, to share thoughts without judgment, and to support one another. By fostering a sense of community and understanding, I hope to mitigate the lingering anxiety and build a foundation for resilience. By the end of the school day, the exhaustion was palpable. My daughter and I walked home, the weight of the past 2 days settling over us like a heavy blanket. I reflected on the magnitude of the events, the quick decisions, the fear, and the relief. I thought of the students, their resilience, and the responsibility I bore as a teacher and a parent. The emotional labor of guiding them through trauma was immense, yet also reinforced the importance of vigilance, empathy, and decisive action. That night, as my daughter slept peacefully, I sat in silence, contemplating the fragility of safety the strength required to maintain it, and the invisible burdens carried by those entrusted with the care of young lives. I realized that the story was far from over. While the immediate danger had passed, the investigation was ongoing, the psychological scars were still forming, and the school community would continue to process what had happened. Every day forward would require attentiveness, understanding, and careful navigation of the subtle dynamics that trauma creates. And though the weight of responsibility felt nearly unbearable at times, I knew that my role was not optional. It was essential. I had survived yesterday, protected my students, and ensured their safety, and now I had to guide them through the complicated journey of recovery while remaining vigilant for any threat that might arise in the future. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and procedural formalities, each one layered with an undercurrent of unease that refused to dissipate. The boy's absence from the school was a constant, haunting presence. His empty seat at the back of the classroom felt like a silent reminder of how fragile safety really was. Every glance toward that spot made my stomach tighten. Every whisper that passed between students seemed to echo yesterday's terror. The investigation had begun in earnest. District officials, police officers, and counselors visited our classrooms, collecting statements, analyzing timelines, and trying to piece together the boys' intentions. Each interview seemed more grueling than the last, both for the students and for me. I had to recount every detail I remembered, reliving the terror, the adrenaline, and the near catastrophe, knowing that my words could affect both the investigation and the students' emotional recovery. At home, the tension followed me. I found myself replaying each moment, questioning my decisions, wondering if there was something more I could have done to prevent the boy from even bringing the gun to school. Sleep was elusive. I woke repeatedly in the night, heart pounding, reliving the fear in vivid, almost cinematic detail. My daughter sensed my anxiety, and though she tried to reassure me with her youthful optimism, I knew she carried her own fear and uncertainty. We ate meals quietly, spoke in measured tones, and avoided discussing the incident directly, though it hovered over us like a shadow. I realized that the aftermath of trauma extends far beyond the physical event, infiltrating every aspect of daily life, altering routines, and reshaping perceptions of safety. Back at school, the students' emotional state was fragile. Some were unusually withdrawn, barely making eye contact, hesitant to speak even when asked. Others processed their fear differently, asking pointed questions about what could have happened, how the boy had obtained a weapon, and what consequences he would face. I moved carefully among them, providing reassurance, answering questions with honesty tempered by calm authority, and encouraging open dialogue. The counselors worked alongside me, facilitating small group sessions where students could express their feelings, fears, and confusion. The sessions were emotionally charged, tears mingling with quiet relief, nervous laughter with hesitant curiosity. I marveled at the resilience of my students, even as I recognized the long path ahead for their emotional recovery. Meanwhile, the investigation intensified. Law enforcement officials worked with school administrators to review security footage, interview staff, and trace the boy's actions leading up to the incident. Questions were raised about how he had acquired the gun, whether he had planned further attacks, and the level of supervision in the school. I was called upon to provide detailed accounts, including every interaction, every decision, and every moment of hesitation or action. Each retelling forced me to relive the terror, the sweat dripping from my forehead, the adrenaline surging through my veins, and the precise calculations I had made to protect my students. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, but necessary to ensure that justice was pursued and that similar incidents could be prevented in the future. Parents began requesting meetings with teachers, administrators, and counselors. Their concern was palpable, their emotions raw. Questions were sharp, sometimes bordering on accusatory. How could this have happened? Why wasn't it prevented? What are you doing to make sure it never happens again? I answered each question with careful, measured honesty, striving to convey empathy, reassurance, and authority simultaneously. Some parents accepted the explanations and expressed gratitude for the swift response, while others remained anxious, skeptical, and unsettled. The balance of maintaining trust while addressing fear became a delicate dance, requiring both sensitivity and confidence. Every interaction reminded me of the immense responsibility placed upon educators to protect, to guide, and to respond decisively when circumstances threatened the safety of those entrusted to us. As the days progressed, the psychological impact on students became more apparent. Some struggled to concentrate in class, their minds drifting back to the incident whenever a subtle noise or gesture reminded them of the threat. Others exhibited hypervigilance, constantly scanning the classroom, the hallways, and even the windows, anticipating danger that had long passed. I worked closely with counselors to develop strategies to help students process their fear, regain a sense of safety, and restore focus to their learning. Each small step toward recovery was hard-won, every expression of reassurance painstakingly earned. I became acutely aware of the fragility of emotional security and the profound responsibility I bore in guiding these young lives through the aftermath. One afternoon, as I reviewed assignments with a small group of students, I noticed my daughter's gaze wandering toward the empty seat at the back. She was quietly asking questions, her tone curious but tinged with apprehension. I took a deep breath and knelt beside her, speaking softly. "It's okay to be scared. What happened wasn't your fault. You're safe now, and we're going to make sure nothing like this happens again." She nodded, her small hand slipping into mine, a gesture of both comfort and trust. I realized then that protection wasn't just about immediate danger. It was about guiding students through the emotional aftermath, helping them regain confidence in themselves and in the world around them. By the end of the week, security measures had been significantly increased. Metal detectors were temporarily installed at entrances, bag checks became routine, and additional staff patrolled hallways during transition periods. These measures provided a tangible sense of safety, but they also served as a constant reminder of the incident, an ever-present symbol of the fragility of normalcy. Students slowly began to adjust, though occasional whispers, nervous glances, and subdued laughter reminded me that the shadow of fear lingered. I focused on reinforcing routines, maintaining calm authority, and providing ongoing emotional support, knowing that recovery would be incremental, fragile, and easily disrupted. At home, the quiet evenings offered little respite. My mind remained restless, replaying scenarios, analyzing decisions, and wondering what might have happened if even one factor had gone differently. I held my daughter close, marveling at her resilience and maturity, while silently acknowledging my own vulnerability. I knew that as the immediate danger receded, the long-term emotional work had only just begun. Protecting students and children is not a momentary act. It is a sustained commitment, requiring vigilance, empathy, and unwavering resolve. The following week, the school settled into a fragile rhythm. It was not normal, not in any sense of the word, but the initial chaos had subsided enough for routines to resume. Students returned to their desks, assignments were distributed, and lessons continued, though every glance toward the back of the room reminded me that fear still lingered in invisible ways. The empty chair had become almost a symbol, a silent monument to the danger that had intruded into their lives and mine. I moved through the classroom carefully, aware of how each word, each gesture, and each interaction could influence the student's sense of security. Small reassurances, gentle corrections, and consistent routines became tools of restoration, each aimed at rebuilding trust, confidence, and the fragile sense of normalcy that had been shattered. Law enforcement continued their investigation, and every day brought more details. The boy had not acted alone in acquiring the weapon. Questions arose about how it had been obtained, whether there had been planning, and whether any outside influence had played a role. I was summoned multiple times to provide statements, detailing not only what had occurred, but the exact context, the student interactions, and my observations of behavior leading up to the incident. Each retelling sent a shiver down my spine, reliving the fear, the adrenaline, and the urgency that had dominated my actions. Yet despite the mental strain, I recognized the importance of precision, of providing accurate accounts to prevent future incidents and to ensure accountability. Meanwhile, the students were beginning to process their emotions in more concrete ways. Small gestures indicated progress. A laugh in a hallway, a whispered joke during group work, a student approaching me to discuss something unrelated to the incident. These moments were brief, fragile sparks of normalcy, yet they were crucial. I encouraged students to express themselves openly, to acknowledge the fear and anxiety they carried, and to support one another. I watched my daughter closely, noting how she had regained some composure, though she remained vigilant. When she glanced at me, I offered a small smile, silently reminding her that safety, although sometimes fragile, could be rebuilt with care, communication, and trust. Parents remained active participants in the recovery process. Meetings, phone calls, and emails filled my days as I reassured them of the ongoing support being provided to their children. I listened patiently to their fears, frustrations, and, in some cases, anger. Some parents struggled to understand how a child could bring a gun to school, while others were primarily concerned with their child's emotional well-being. Each conversation demanded empathy, honesty, and clarity. I reminded myself that essay interactions were not simply about conveying information. They were about rebuilding trust, providing comfort, and modeling calm assurance in a situation that had defied rational explanation. The district provided additional resources, including on-site psychologists and counselors trained to work with trauma. I coordinated with them, ensuring that each student received personalized attention, whether through individual counseling or small group sessions. Some students responded quickly, engaging in dialogue, asking questions, and gradually regaining confidence. Others required more time, retreating into silence or distraction as a coping mechanism. Observing these patterns reinforced my understanding of trauma's complexity, the ways in which fear manifests, the subtle signs of anxiety, and the unpredictable path to emotional recovery. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally, yet profoundly necessary. One afternoon, as I reviewed assignments with my students, I noticed subtle changes in their interactions. Students who had been withdrawn now shared ideas with cautious enthusiasm, collaborated with peers more freely, and occasionally allowed themselves small moments of laughter. I encouraged these gestures, recognizing them as signs of progress, however incremental. I took a moment to speak quietly with my daughter, acknowledging the courage she had demonstrated, and reminding her that while the world could sometimes feel frightening, resilience and vigilance were equally powerful tools. She nodded, her expression serious yet calmer than before, a reflection of the careful guidance, reassurance, and love she had received. By the end of the week, the investigation had yielded results. The boy's parents were involved, law enforcement had compiled a thorough report, and steps were being taken to ensure that he would not pose a danger to other students again. The school administration communicated these measures to the community, providing transparency while balancing the sensitivity of the situation. I watched as students absorbed this information, some visibly relieved, others contemplative, and a few still processing the enormity of what had occurred. I knew that while immediate safety had been restored, the emotional aftermath would continue to ripple through the classroom and the community for weeks, months, and perhaps years. That evening, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, reviewing notes, emails, and observations from the past week. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon me. I had guided students through fear, maintained composure under pressure, and helped navigate an unprecedented crisis. Yet the memory of the gun, the seconds that had felt like lifetimes, and the potential consequences that had loomed over us remained vivid. I realized that teaching was no longer simply about academics, lesson plans, or grades. It was about protecting lives, stirring resilience, and maintaining vigilance in the face of unpredictability. I thought about my daughter, the students in my care, and the countless others who depended on adults to act decisively when danger appeared unexpectedly. The enormity of that responsibility was humbling, terrifying, and profoundly human. As the night deepened, I reflected on the lessons learned. Fear is a powerful, tangible force, but so too is courage. The choices made in moments of crisis define outcomes, shape perceptions, and leave lasting impressions on those involved. I recognize the importance of preparation, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when circumstances demand it. I also understood that recovery, both for myself and for my students, would be a gradual process, requiring patience, empathy, and ongoing support. And despite the lingering anxiety, a sense of quiet resolve settled within me, that no matter the challenges ahead, I would continue to protect, guide, and nurture the students entrusted to my care. The final week of the aftermath felt like walking through a strange, delicate balance between normalcy and vigilance. The boy responsible for bringing the gun to school had been formally charged, his parents cooperating with authorities, and the school had implemented permanent changes to enhance security. Metal detectors remained at entrances, bag inspections were routine, and staff patrols were increased. These measures brought a sense of security to some, yet they also served as constant reminders of how fragile our safety had been. Students walked the hallways with cautious confidence, testing the boundaries of comfort, while teachers, including myself, remained hyper-aware of every detail, every shift in behavior, and every subtle sign of lingering fear. Counseling sessions continued, but slowly, small victories began to emerge. Students who had once seemed withdrawn started to engage more actively in class, participate in discussions, and collaborate with their peers. Some who had been hesitant to speak aloud in the days immediately following the incident now shared their thoughts, their fears, and even their humor with cautious optimism. I watched these transformations closely, offering reassurance, encouragement, and validation. I knew that recovery was neither linear nor guaranteed, yet these moments provided tangible proof that resilience could be nurtured and strengthened over time. My daughter was thriving, though the experience had left a subtle mark on her personality. She approached me one evening as we reviewed her homework, her voice quiet but determined. "Mom," she said, "I'm okay now, but I'll never forget it. And I'll always know what to do if something like that happens again." I held her hand gently, feeling both pride and a quiet pang of lingering. Fear. Her words reflected a maturity beyond her years, a clear understanding of the seriousness of the event, and a resilience born from experiencing something no child should ever endure. I realized that my role as her parent extended far beyond typical guidance. It included instilling awareness, courage, and preparedness without fostering unnecessary fear. At school, I received messages from parents expressing gratitude for the vigilance and composure displayed during the incident. Some shared stories of how their children had recounted the event at home, describing the courage they had witnessed from both students and staff. Others expressed relief that the school had acted decisively and effectively, preventing a tragedy that could have changed countless lives. These messages, while emotionally charged, provided a sense of closure, affirming that our collective efforts had made a tangible difference. I took comfort in knowing that, despite the fear and uncertainty, the situation had been handled with diligence, empathy, and courage. The students gradually returned to routines that resembled pre-incident normalcy. Classes resumed their usual pace, lessons continued, and group activities regained their vitality. Yet, beneath the surface, the memory of the event lingered, a subtle undercurrent shaping behavior, interactions, and perceptions. I encouraged discussions about safety, personal responsibility, and emotional processing, fostering an environment where students could openly address their feelings. This transparency and ongoing support helped to build resilience, trust, and a deeper sense of community within the classroom. I could see that the shared experience, while traumatic, had strengthened bonds among students and between students and teachers. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in class, I reflected on my own journey through the incident. The adrenaline, fear, and split-second decisions of that day had left a lasting imprint on me. I had learned the importance of vigilance, the power of calm authority, and the profound responsibility that comes with safeguarding others. I realized that teaching is not merely a profession. It is a commitment to protect, guide, and nurture, especially when unexpected crises arise. The incident had reshaped my understanding of my role as an educator, parent, and member of the community, reinforcing the value of preparedness, empathy, and courage. As the final day of the official recovery program approached, the atmosphere in the school was markedly lighter, though cautious optimism remained. Students had regained confidence, routines were firmly reestablished, and discussions about the incident had transformed from fear-driven recollections to reflective learning experiences. In one last counseling session, students were encouraged to articulate lessons learned, emotions felt, and strategies for maintaining safety in the future. The conversations were insightful, heartfelt, and sometimes humorous, reflecting the complex interplay of fear, resilience, and growth that had characterized the past weeks. I listened attentively, offering guidance, validation, and support, proud of the students' progress and deeply aware of the journey that had brought us to this point. Walking home that evening with my daughter, I felt a sense of relief that had been absent for weeks. The fear that had gripped the school, the students, and myself was slowly being replaced by a cautious sense of safety and a renewed appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life. My daughter squeezed my hand and said softly, "We made it, Mom. We really made it." I smiled, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift slightly, though aware that vigilance would always remain a part of our lives. In the quiet of the night, as I reflected on the entire experience, I realized that what had begun as an ordinary school day had transformed into an extraordinary test of courage, resilience, and human connection. Students had learned the importance of vigilance, emotional awareness, and community. Parents had witnessed the dedication and decisiveness of those entrusted with their children's safety, and I had gained a renewed understanding of the profound responsibilities inherent in teaching and parenting. The incident had left scars, but it also revealed strengths, fostered growth, and reinforced the power of preparedness, empathy, and unwavering resolve. And as I finally allowed myself to exhale, I knew that while the memory of fear would never fully fade, the lessons learned, bonds strengthened, and courage displayed would endure, shaping the students, the school, and myself for years to come.